should we make of this, Bill? Because it looks terrible, but the market continues to breeze through it. And according to Goldman Sachs, over the next 2 quarters, we're going to actually have more disposable income after the fiscal policy than we did at the end of 2019. So should we be worried or relieved?
Oliver, I absolutely agree. The unemployment numbers are incredibly tragic, worse than depression. So everything is terrible, and yet the market is saying we're going to see our way through this. And you know, the hint in the market's recovery is the blueprint to the path that the policymakers have set forward. The Fed has ensured markets are going to be functioning. So that means that with this adequate liquidity, and once firms start to come back online, they're going to have enough funding in order to continue their businesses. The second thing is the NASDAQ is up so much. What does that mean? It means that the most important influence in the recovery is going to be technology. And technology is going to be leading the way out, both in terms of finding a way for companies to bring their production back into this country, to deglobalize in a way that ensures national security, but at the same time, continue to keep costs down. I hear that the sneaker manufacturers are starting to bring their production back to Atlanta because they're finding ways of having machines make sneakers. So I think the answer to your question is the economic numbers that we're hearing today, the labor markets in particular, is showing a tragic story, a story of how the U.S. is highly dependent on service economy, a service economy that's very labor intensive. The recovery in the stock market is showing us the path out of this conundrum, which is technology, both biotechnology to give us the vaccine and medical treatments that are needed to ensure safety so that people are willing to come out and continue their business as usual, and a way of adapting business as usual in order that companies are able to survive in the post-COVID environment.
Now, we don't know how the post-COVID environment is going to go. We're like in the very, very possibly early nascent stages of that. Bill, when we think about the reopening versus the quarantine, though, I know everybody wants to reopen, and that's where the real economic engine is going to turn back on because that services economy can come back. But are people underappreciating the amount of our economy that functions inside? I mean, the whole narrative about depression looked to me like it went bunk when Microsoft said that they were unaffected by the entire situation, the biggest company in the world. How can that happen if we're in a depression? I mean, should we give credit to what we can do inside?
It's amazing how adaptive the service economy has become. It's amazing how much of the service economy can be done by remote. So I think, and as I said, it's the technology that's enabled this kind of production shift almost on a dime, right? And so what we have in hand then for the policymakers is, what about the low wage worker, the Amazon worker that has to go to the warehouse, the delivery man that has to bring that package to our door? What is it that policy can do to make sure that these people have adequate income and these companies that provide these services are able to survive? And that's where we have the Main Street lending program on the part of the Fed. That's where we have the PPP program that the Treasury has put out and small business, which unfortunately has been bungled in terms of the implementation. But absolutely, the difficulty we're going to see ahead and why the market is so uncertain is because we're not sure the government policies will be implemented in a way that they're intended. We already see the screw up associated with PPP and its distribution or unfair distribution across different firms.
So there's been some hiccups here, to your point, no doubt, and there could be speed bumps or roadblocks ahead. Bill, should we abandon the narrative that many went to early on, that this is going to be a 1930 experience or even a Great Recession post-financial crisis? How many historical comparisons should we be putting to the side right now?
We should put aside every economic-based downturn, whether it's the Great Depression because the central bank didn't provide enough liquidity, that's been handled, or the Great Recession of 2008, where the real estate market collapsed that threatened the entire financial system, and no one was sure whether there'll be a financial system to actually lubricate the financing that's needed. That's been handled, right? The banks are well capitalized. So this is a health policy induced recession where the switch was turned off because we had to locked down for safety, health safety reasons. When the switch comes back on, are we clear that there's going to be an adequate corporate infrastructure and labor market infrastructure and a willingness on the part of consumers and workers to go back to work? That's the main question, and that's dependent upon health technology, whether or not we can get treatment or get vaccines. If we don't have that, we're not going to have a recovery.
What do you make of what we've seen from China so far, Bill? Is it an appropriate gauge for how this might go? I just saw a number the other day about their car sales, which are actually pretty good. They're doing like a W, maybe not a sharp V, but they're coming back pretty quick according to the data.
I'm so glad you asked that question because I am so sick and tired of hearing China provides us a blueprint of the way out of here. I really have been very suspicious of Chinese data. And when you talk to people who are really on the ground, and my spies in China are telling me that as much as factories have been turned back on, orders have been canceled because they are part of the supply chain to Europe, and Europe is still in the doldrums, and they are not providing the orders. Factories have been turned on, electricity use has gone up, but the managers are very smart because they know that the government policy officials are looking at electricity usage. So they turn on the factories, they turn on the machines, and they just wind up the machines with nobody operating them. Why? Because workers are still afraid to go to work. And you can tell because schools haven't opened. If once schools open, you know that they're willing to put their kids at risk. Wuhan just opened their schools this week. And so when you think about life in China coming back to normal, a lot of the usage numbers may have come back to normal, but certainly the restaurants are not full, the malls are not full, and China is now worried about a second wave of infections coming in from Russia in Harbin. So, and that has not been reported very widely. We know that Asia in general is now worried about that second wave. Singapore, for sure, is suffering even worse than the first wave because it's among a class of workers they can't track very well, the migrant workers, the immigrant workers. So I think for us, we have to be careful in our reopening that we have adequate safety net in place, health safety nets, so that we don't have that second wave problem, and also that we have adequate testing so that we know the status of how safe the environment really is. We won't be having a normal economy unless we have that health safety assurance.
Bill, part of me hears that and thinks that basically we should just take it with a big grain of salt and we should err on the very cautious side of overall the global kind of bounce back. But then the other side sounds like, well, maybe if there's a manufacturing heavy economy in China as opposed to the services heavy economy here, that there's potential for an economic leadership shift, because if they can just go and flip on a steel mill or a copper mill because that's what they're producing, as opposed to people having to provide face-to-face services, is there a potential regime shift where the speed of comeback could be in China or the rest of the world ex-US's favor?
Great question. In fact, the actual data have anticipated what you were suspecting. The manufacturing sector in China, as important as it is, has become less important. The service sector actually is almost about 50% of the Chinese economy. So that's why the unrest among workers, the unrest among consumers, and especially that rising middle class of highly educated people, they're expecting life to continue to progress. Don't forget, one of the state goals was to reduce poverty by half by the end of this year. Are they going to still be able to do that? Are they going to be able to give the kind of life that the party promises to its people? That is in question right now because the retail and consumer-facing economy really hasn't come back on, and because of that suspicion that it's really not safe to get out there. So China has done a lot of things. Don't get me wrong. Their policy of lockdown has been the most effective in the world. They've contained a lot of the virus. But the fear factor is something they can't contain. And that fear factor is something that's going to keep the Chinese economy from resuming its normal trajectory. And that's a roadmap for us. We have to make sure the fear factor is taken away as quickly as possible.
Okay, Bill, I want to keep you here for another couple minutes because when we think about what's happening for the market reaction relative to everything you're discussing, it sounds like you're telling a more cautionary tale about how this is going to be a slow chug back. Now, we know what's happening for stocks. I want to put that to a side for a second. I want to talk about bonds with you because it seems like the only thing right now that puts a real bid under the bond market is not any of this data. 10-year yields are up off the low. They haven't had a sizable rally really since that low. And yesterday was the biggest one we had in a month. because there was rumor and chatter and stories about negative interest rates. Is that a possibility? Is that a real possibility that people should be pricing in?
I hope we learn our lessons from Japan and Europe and don't venture into that. Chair Powell has been very adamant that the negative rates is not an appropriate policy tool for the U.S. economy at this time. And when you think about it, the thing that's holding back aggregate demand is not the cost of funding. Let's face it, there's so much liquidity out there, anybody can get a loan if it's a good project. The distortion of negative rates has killed the Japanese economy. It's about to kill the European banking system. And that's the last thing we want to have here. So I think but the talk of negative rates, and so many of my professional colleagues are saying we should consider negative rates as a policy tool. We shouldn't put it aside for the Fed. That is very dangerous talk because it's really going down the wrong path. But because there's so much of that talk, the bond market's being influenced by it. One thing I should add, Oliver, I was on a call with the Milken sponsors, some high-level advisors that I can't talk about because of Chatham House rules, but you'd recognize their names instantly. I asked them, what is an investable environment in the future? What is it that you're looking for in the post-COVID environment that's different from what you saw before? And my main question was, how has the Fed intervention and Treasury guarantees affected your assessment of credit instruments? What is credit risk in this post-COVID world? I didn't get a really good answer, but there was a lot of chatter about how distortions by the Fed can't make a bad company into a good company. So for sure, distressed debt and bottom fishers in that world will continue, but the timeline is certainly going to be prolonged because of that extra liquidity, Main Street loans that might be put in there. So there might be a lot of obscuring in that bond market, corporate debt market, in terms of being able to sort out the good investment opportunities from the ones that are about to die.
Yeah. Bill, always a pleasure to chat with you here for the big picture. Appreciate the insight into what you're hearing in your own conversations about the global economy. Bill Lee joining us from the Milken Institute. Thanks a lot, Bill, for walking us through here all the way to the market open.